Sorry, y'all. We already hit the 1 hour mark. I didn't even notice.
What happened?
Somehow, we
They
already
don't
hit.
want to
So,
be great.
so Insta does this thing where we now can only do a 1 hour live. And first of all, I didn't even
Neither did
realize
I.
we hit an hour.
Okay.
That was, I was like,
That's rude.
how is it already an hour? The disrespect. I was like zooming in. I'm like, I want to see what's going on in Mardi Gras. See what it is. So I'm praying and hoping Akeem's phone didn't die. Oh wait, I think they're here. Let's see. Hi Pearl Styles. Ahlan wa sahlan. I'm getting my Eid outfit from Pearl Styles. So super excited. I was sliding in their DM. I'm like, price me this. But she has these beautiful, beautiful Palestinian thobes. So I'm just like, this year I'm gonna be rocking the Palestinian. Oh, okay. Hold on. I see Akeem here. Akeem only has a 5% battery. Okay, Akeem, come and then just like wrap up your last thing, just so everyone can see you. And you have to say goodbye. You can't not say goodbye. That is just rude. Okay, hold on. Let me try his personal page. It's so funny. Give
Activists,
him a
one
second.
of the things they always walk around with a portable charger. Like that's something you never.
Charger.
Yeah. He's late. He's late to the game.
I
Yeah.
I know. I'm gonna send him one. I'm gonna send him. Okay, so I think
Yeah.
unfortunately his phone may have died because he's not in. So if he gets charged and comes up while we're wrapping up, we'll let him come so he can say goodbye. So oh yeah, I loved a lot of what was shared, like because it's so true and lots to unpack. But I'm gonna go to y'all because I definitely want to hear what is your definition of Pan-Africanism.
Did I go? I don't know who's going. um,
Yes, I don't
I
care.
think
Go for it.
to me, from from my Sudanese standpoint, I would say uh, Pan Africanism means unity. I agree with Hakeem on that. I think it definitely means a bolstered unity. I don't think we're united now. I don't think, I think even within our regions, we're not as united as we could be.
Yeah.
But I think before that, to me, it means education. We have to learn about the rest of the continent. We have to learn about ourselves first. I think getting an accurate history of ourselves, or a complete one anyway, as I think, especially for Sudan, we're not taught our complete history.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I was talking to my dad the other day, and he was saying that the first lesson in history class, so like say maybe fourth grade, is
Hmm.
uh, the arrival of Arabs to Sudan. That's the very first lesson you learn.
Oh
You
hell,
don't learn
hell
anything
no.
before that. So Sudan did not even exist before that in the collective consciousness based on
We
right,
were
based
just
on this
sitting there
history.
waiting.
So getting a complete history of Sudan, or diving into a complete history of Sudan, I think is important. I mean, our countries, not just Sudan, but like our countries in general is important. And then learning about one another. I mean, my entire education was World War I and World War II. Anything I
Yeah,
remember from history class is about Europe or America. I did not learn anything
yeah,
about Africa at all. And I didn't
no,
grow up in Sudan. I grew up only partially in Sudan, but we know more about off the continent than we do on. So I think learning about each other is incredibly important. That's what builds unity. I think knowing, having that information, seeing
hmm,
those similarities, recognizing that we are not as different from each other as they want us to believe, is the first step towards true Pan-Africanism, towards building that unity and making that a reality.
yeah, absolutely. Oh, I love that. And what
Yeah.
about you, Bear?
I just like every time you speak, Sarah, I vividly like I see myself. I can relate to everything that you're saying. The fact that the only thing I remember about my history lessons is, the World Wars One and Two. It's crazy, and I didn't know that up until I left Ethiopia and I went abroad to study for, university, and I had an opportunity to meet other Africans, and how little I knew about their background, their history was so crazy to me, and yet I came
Mm,
from a country that prides itself in being, Pan-Africans, champion of Africans all together, and yet I didn't know anything. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Governments intentionally keep their population ignorant and uninformed because that helps them impose their oppression on them. So because they know how powerful Pan-Africanism can be when it's implemented, properly. They make sure that we don't know anything about each other. So it was crazy to me. It was so wild that I knew more about World War I and World War II, rather than other conflicts that happened across the continent and how they might have affected the future of, the continent, or even my future, my life.
mhm,
So it was crazy to me. So I can completely relate to that, and I think it's true all across the continent. But for me, Pan-Africanism is being intentional. It's about intentionality, being intentional about the ideas and ideals that you fight for, being intentional about the language, the knowledge that you consume, being intentional on how you use your power to uplift others, being intentional about every aspect of your life, recognizing that we all have a purpose while living in this earth, and using that purpose towards the good of not only our community but the greater African continent and humanity at large. So for me,
mm,
Pan-Africanism is being intentional, and I think when we are intentional, it would be easy for us to unite. It would be easy for us to revolt against these oppressive regimes across
absolutely.
the continent and to forge a better future for all of us. When we're not intentional is when we get played by those in power, and we're pitted against each other, and we demolish our future and our history. We just make it so easy to be controlled and to be oppressed. So I think there is power in intentionality, and that's how I define being Pan-Africans, for me at least, because um, the very cliche definition of Pan-Africanism is this unity coming together, or finding your roots back to the motherland, whatever. But this kind of definitions and understanding of Pan-Africanism, like I alluded to earlier, has been weaponized by states to strengthen their reign and to block any kind of meaningful intervention or meaningful revolution that comes from the people to benefit the people. So I think it's about time that we get rid of this old age definition of Pan-Africanism, and that we find the true meaning of Pan-Africanism. I believe our ancestors, when they, incepted this idea of Pan-Africanism, their goal was to see a liberated and free continent, not only free of the shackles of slavery, or the shackle of westernization, but also free of the shackles of oppression and lack of democracy. And like I said earlier, oppressors come from within our communities as well. And so when we're intentional, it would be so clear to us that the idea of Pan-Africanism is not only meant to it's not only like a means or a framework that helps us to fight against colonialism or neoliberalism, but it should be, and it is a lens that helps us to fight against oppression and dictatorship. And so, but we won't be able to have this kind of understanding if we're not intentional about the way we lead our life, the way we analyze information, because governments are busy feeding us propaganda that only serves their purpose. They dehumanize a portion of their society. They make a portion of their community the other within its own community, so the citizenry can rally behind them in whatever agenda they might have, regardless of how dominate, like how cruel that agenda might be. So if we're not intentional, we risk believing all this propaganda and hate speech that goes around, against everybody, and we will be used by governments that have malice. So I think being intentional should be at the core and center of Pan-Africanism. And after that, like I said, it will be easy to forge unity. It will be easy to have a better life, and also to recognize our innate differences. But if you're not intentional, you just go however they want you to go, and then you will be fed information that doesn't necessarily serve your purpose, and you will find yourself sometime down the line being at the receiving end of that oppression. So I think intentionality is how I define Pan-Africanism.
Right,
take a
right.
minute?
Can we just take a moment? Because that was, as you were talking, I was just thinking about all of these. I mean, you're hitting so many points, and they all apply. They all apply. When you said, oh, talking about how that a person will end up reaching you down the line, if that's not about that, if that is not a read on Sudan, I don't know what is. Because truly,
Thank you.
what's happening now is a demonstration of exactly that. We allowed ourselves to be swept up by the propaganda, and we were brainwashed into believing it, and now that same propaganda has been turned against us. That reality has now been turned against us, and we're just realizing, oh, this is what everybody was talking about. Huh. Right. Yeah,
Oh, we
exactly.
see it now.
So,
Listen,
I love
we
you
don't
for
want to
saying
know more.
that. Thank you so much. You're amazing. You're amazing.
Yeah. Eight, yes. And just like to that, like one of the things that I always find myself reflecting on when I'm thinking about Pan-Africanism, for me, I'm like roots. Who were we before they told us who we are, right? And one of the big things that I'm constantly going back to is like our ancestry. So, like, we had kingdoms, we had trade, we had stability, we built civilization. What have we stepped away from that we can try and reclaim now, right? Because each one of our histories is just so rich of knowledge and education. And when there's such an intentional dismantling of something from foreign powers, from colonialization, that's where I pause and I'm like, okay, so what was in there that they did not want us to have any more access to, because that's probably where the magic sauce is. That's where the secrets are. We don't need to recreate the wheel. Like, it was working for thousands of years. Can we apply it into a modern lens? And the more I learn, the more I read, it's even just the worldview is completely different, right? I was having this conversation earlier, and it was actually about the Jordanian king, how he was coming on and finally saying something, whatever. But, you look at him, perfect English, perfect suit, and I'm like, okay, what's the difference between you and a European? Like, where's your culture? Where's your essence? And then I also see that a lot on the continent. A lot of these leaders, even in how we navigate with each other, like day to day, we're wearing Western clothes. We save our traditional clothes for special occasions, right? Day to day, we're like on our English platforms, on our Western platforms, and then on occasion or when need be, we go to things that are more embedded in culture, right? It's secondary, it's an afterthought, right? Can we start flipping that around and start centering our lineages, our history, our ways of being? Because each and every one of our traditions was collectivist. None of it was individualistic. It was so you could go from one area to another and be like, oh, come, like, let me feed you, let me like take care of you, like you're here visiting me and my people, so I'm gonna be a good representative of my people by taking care of you. And we've now gotten, and I don't want to say like hyper individuality fully in the sense of how it is in the US, because I think with the continent, it's almost like tribal individualism or national individualism, where it's just like, I'll take care of my people and screw everybody else. Like, that's all I think about. That's all I'm going to care for, right? And all that really does is just like take that like hyper individuality and just make it a little bit bigger. So there's a little bit more room. But at the end of the day, it still does the same thing, right? And the same way that we see here in the West how toxic that hyper individuality is and how it kills the soul and how it leads to so much depression and even completely messes with your health, that's happening within our communities because we're trying to create this false sense of safety through othering everyone else based off of a narrative that was passed down to us from some institution, place, or space that was hell bent on ensuring that we were not only removed from one another, but also removed from our history. And so, can Africa, can our people, can our continent become our center and everything else be the secondary? Because if we're not even putting ourselves first,
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know why that took me out, but really, truly, yeah.
Yeah, I think, just to interject here, we put ourselves, we try to be the center of things when we shouldn't, and we fail to do so when we should. It's crazy. Like, um, for example, I've said this on a different platform, but the way African ministers like are quick to jump to go to Europe to mourn the passing of some kind of colonial figure, the queen and
oh,
everyone
the queen.
else,
Everybody went.
the
Everybody went to
way
the damn queen.
they
Yeah.
like they run to defend people that are far away from the continent and how they fail people that are within their own continent. It's so mind-boggling to me. Like, I don't get it. I don't understand it. And they speak in one voice. They say, us Africans. I'm like, wow, great job. Like, this is a step towards the right direction, but can you maybe exactly,
Can
because
you turn
I
it?
mean, it's like I don't think they understand how precedent works. I don't think they understand the power of precedent, the message that they're sending through their action and inactions, right? When they failed to act in Tigray, it was a matter of time before a similar or even worse conflict happens in another country within Africa. Because what the African Union and IGAD did is give this legal justification of, committing a genocide, massacring a group of people. If you don't like them, if anything that they're doing comes on your way of pursuing power unconstitutionally or undemocratically, then you can weaponize your power and you can do whatever the heck you want. And we will be there to defend you at the International Court of Criminal Court or at the UN. Everywhere you go, we'll be there blocking every potential intervention that could save lives. That's exactly the message, right? Yeah, I mean, you
Sudan.
saw the three African countries who are members of the UN Security Council were actively blocking any and every kind of intervention in the Tigray genocide. They were there actively saying African solutions for African problems. I don't even know what the heck that means, but that was their motto. And they were actively defending the Ethiopian government and the Eritrean government as they rape women, as they massacre civilians, as they destroy an entire region and put Tigray under complete siege. Literally everything that you're seeing in Gaza has been tried and tested in Tigray, and it was proven to be effective in terms of massacring innocent people and with impunity. So it was the African leaders that were actively defending this kind of move. So it's so mind-boggling to me that these African leaders find it so convenient to center Africa or values of the continent when it comes to defending themselves, but when it comes to serving the people, they're never they're never around. So that is, and like, to make matters worse, there are also African intellectuals, African opinion makers and shapers who fall into these traps and actively support and perpetuate this kind of mentality. So we're a very bizarre continent. I think we need a lot of soul searching. I feel like we need to have a moment and really to reflect on our journey and to see, really question the values that we hold dear to us. I was so proud of South Africa, for example, when they took Israel to the ICC. But I'm like, where the heck were you when the Ethiopian government was committing the same, if not worse, crime right under, in your continent? Where are you when civilians in Congo continue to suffer for centuries? When are you civilians in Sudan are faced with horrific reality that you can, implement the same international human rights laws and norms and treaties to hold these people that are in power that continue to eliminate indigenous people and uproot them from their homes. So it's so crazy to me how we're so selective.
Well, they're all bought
Yeah,
and
but
paid
even
for.
that, even
They're
that,
all
even when
for.
you're bought and paid for, there should be a voice in your head that says, oh, if you want to fake it,
No.
even if you want
Well,
to fake it
yeah.
and, look like you care about human rights, you have to do something in your own home. It's only if you do something there that you will get the kind of legitimacy and credibility that you need. But it's so crazy. And then this is the same even for um, intellectuals or influential people of African descent. You have people like Trevor Noah, for example. He prides himself on being African all the time. I'm sick and tired of it, but never ever dares to open his mouth to save Africans that are suffering under the dictatorship of oppressive governments. He didn't say anything about Tigray. He didn't say anything about Congo. He didn't say anything about Sudan, but he's the first to open his mouth when it comes to Ukraine and everywhere else. So I'm like, I'm not saying they shouldn't
Yeah.
advocate for this type of issues, but change starts from within. If you don't change yourself, if you don't fix your home, if you don't put your home in order, everything else you do is just fake. It's only for the show, and no one would take you seriously. I feel like that's how most African leaders, lost their power because, they try to confront this Western colonizers, this, neoliberalism, whatever. But
Well, most of them are
yeah, well,
educated out in the
I
West,
mean,
though.
I was educated on the West. My first degree is from South Korea, second degree is here from the US, but I
Yep.
made the choice of being intentional. Everything is a choice. No matter how dire the situation is, we always have the option and the choice to make better decisions. So I don't think, this being brainwashed and everything, especially when you intentionally seek power and you want to be in office to serve, you can't really excuse your stupid political choices and policies on by claiming, oh, I was educated in the West, I was brainwashed. No, you made an intentional choice to be like that, to eliminate people, to oppress people, to be a puppet for this, white colonizers, wherever they might be. And it's not always about, I also don't fit into this narrative of, it's the West that is forcing these African governments to do all these horrific things. Yeah, it's
No, they're
selfish
corrupt. They're
interest. Yeah,
corrupt and
so
they're insane.
because
Yeah,
we
yeah, no,
know
but that's
we
the
know
thing.
there were exemplary African leaders who defied that kind of mentality and served their people.
And
We lost them.
we lost
Ask
them right
questions.
away.
How was the Ethiopian late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi? How did he die? Like after only a week of participating in the G7 meeting, how did he die all of a sudden? How did the Ghanaian president at that time, who died in the same exact month? How?
Kwame.
And these are people who were so bright. These are people who challenged not only exactly, and
Those
who
are real
transformed their
leaders.
country in a meaningful way. Now, what you're saying is this some like I don't know if they're pastors, I don't know if they're preachers or if they're political leaders. I can't even tell them apart. But they kind of want people to worship them. They don't want anyone to question. Like they use this.
Oh, Sada, what did that do for you? I saw that reaction. Tell us, speak.
Again, completely on point. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
just,
yeah.
and how they are silencing the African generation is by building these flashy things. They distract us by building maybe one beautiful, like, I don't know, water fountain. Why an entire generation is going hungry because they can't have food, not even once, let alone 3 times a day. They build palaces for themselves. It's so flashy. You can go there and, have a good Sunday, whatever. But you have half of your entire population illiterate because there aren't schools. You have mothers dying while birthing because there is no access to reproductive health care. And yet, these governments, they build these flashy things. They organize concerts. It's all about the show. Exactly. And
Manufactured.
this
Yeah.
is a replica of exactly that's happening in Dubai. This is how you see the influence of these Gulf countries and how they're influencing the African continent
Yep.
and the world. So
Thank you.
it's
Thank
so
you.
crazy
Thank
to me.
you.
But I also wanted to flag in this book, I think this it's called
Which one?
it's called Theories
Right.
of
Turn it this
Development.
way.
It's a very important book. Like it's a hard read. It's
No.
kind of an academic book, but I think it helps us understand how we got to where we are and why and how we can get out of it. It's all about development, how development is measured, what it means to be developed and everything. But it clearly, looks into the difference between, different cultures and how cultures play into our understanding of developmentalism, development and democracy and everything else. I say this because I heard you talking about, like centering African heritage, our culture, our history, and how that's important. But I think we also shouldn't be naive. We have to understand there are stages that countries pass through, countries go through, like all this conflict that we're seeing, how some governments have to choose between, pushing development, economic development over, respecting human rights. Like these choices are choices that every other country in the West had to go through. But they don't tell you that story. They hide that history because that's the true way towards development. That's the true way towards, being prosperous. But because they don't want us, they want us to remain poor and dependent on their aid, so they don't necessarily tell you the true path towards development. But I think this book is very helpful, and I think it would be beautiful to speak our languages, to communicate with the entire world using our native tongue. But we know we don't have the money at the moment. So we have to develop our country. We have to do whatever it takes to get there. And after we get there, we will use our language not only between ourselves, but we'll also force the country to learn. Like, look at South Korea, for example. I studied in South Korea and I was there, and they don't even care to speak English. They don't care. Like in my university, like every book is
No.
translated into Korean. Every resource that you could ever need is translated into Korean. Why? Because they have the power, they have the means to do that. But it took them almost 50 or 20 years to get there. And they were intentional about every step they took. They were intentional about the policies they implemented.
Oh, yeah. And especially with
Yeah,
the cultural heritage as well, too,
yeah,
right? Like I lived there for a year myself. And one of the things, like I was teaching English and I would have little 6, 7, 8 year olds like dropping
yeah,
ancient history on me. They knew who they were, they knew where they came from, they knew all of their important emperors, they spoke their language, they knew their traditions, they knew the why
yeah.
behind why they do certain things. Like
Yeah.
they were given everything to make sure that they can
Yes, but they were
succeed in their
able
own
to do that
community.
because they empowered their generation, because they invested heavily on education. Like during the Korean War, many Koreans
Yeah,
who lived abroad,
yeah.
their ultimate goal for every Korean that you come across is to work here and to go back home. They sold their gold necklaces to build their country. Some, like nurses, were sent to German. They served there for free so German could give financial loan to Korea. That was instrumental in transforming the country. So they did all of this because they were intentional. They knew they were destined for greatness. Of course, they had to make some compromises. You know, like some of their younger generation has identity crisis and everything. But the fact that they were so intentional has brought them to the level where they can at least use their language so effectively in empowering their generation. Korea doesn't have any natural resource. Their resource is human power, manpower. They're so educated, and we can do the same.
Mhm.
Yeah, K-pop too.
And K-pop.
I love how you make the conversation light. Yeah. So, but
I'm
I,
just saying.
I'm saying this because there are steps that we need to go through in order to achieve the greatness that we want. But we won't be able to get there unless and otherwise we're intentional about everything that we do now. Because what I see today is just this intentional erosion of our identity, intentional erosion of our heritage, culture, and keeping us apart from each other, and making sure that we never find common ground to rally behind each other. So I wanted to interject and to share that. Sorry. I won't blabbering.
I don't know why you're apologizing. I don't even understand.
Like I don't know if you were like me and Sada were
Right.
like,
Keep going.
keep going,
Seriously.
keep going.
I was gonna say that I think one of the main issues that our leaders have is that they bought into the idea that we're expendable. I think they truly believe in our own invisibility, like the fact that
Mm,
we're not worthy of defense, not worthy of visibility, not worthy of of care. And so to prove, and then there's also this idea of like modernism or modernization equals westernization. You cannot have a modern country with African values. It automatically means to them, because of their education or
us
because of
too.
brainwashing or whatever else, right?
Yeah.
It means becoming more Western,
Yeah.
and and trying to fit that narrative. I think that's why their attention is always elsewhere. They're trying to emulate what Western powers are doing in, looking or trying to be sort of like the stewards of the world. They're trying to sort of fit into that. Oh, we too can do that. But when it comes to Africa, like you said, Maza, African solutions for African problems, but that really just means everybody shut up.
Exactly.
Right? It just means stop
Mm,
talking, right?
Yeah.
yeah.
It doesn't mean let's sit down and find a solution. I think this is something that we've heard throughout the last 10 months of this war in Sudan is African solutions to African problems. Let's get the whatever involved. Or even our own, we say Sudanese solutions for Sudanese problems, but nobody's sitting down to find the solution. There is
Okay, but what's
no
the
solution.
Sudanese solution? Like
No.
we
And you
haven't
know
even
what?
defined it.
Yeah, and you know
So
what?
is
It's
it
so crazy to
just
me. The
gaslighting at
people
this
who
point?
be on the front lines of this kind of narrative are people who have historically committed gross
Okay.
human rights violations.
Oh
For
yeah.
example, when it comes to
Mm,
Tigray, the one person who should be in a church and praying for mercy instead, who was on the front lines of this diplomatic shuttle diplomacy, is what's his name? That Nigerian elderly leader. What's his name? Jomo. What's his name? Oh, not Uhuru Kenyatta.
wait,
The guy who was the leader of Nigeria during the Biafra War. Oh
Um.
my God, his name.
Go Yeah, go
Google.
ahead.
Um, uh,
Perfect.
Somebody say it in the comments.
Obasanjo, Obasanjo, I think
My brain,
Obasanjo.
yeah.
Oba, so Obasanjo,
Okay. Oh
I
yeah.
mean, no shade to
Obasanjo.
Nigerian people. I love Nigerian people, so please don't get me wrong. But he was on the front lines of the shuttle diplomacy between Tigray and the federal government of Ethiopia on behalf of the African elderly. I'm like, first of all, you have ruined your generation. Now you're working to ruin my generation and the next generation. Like, take several seats, like go to church or something, beg for mercy. Because seriously, this guy has a blood on his hand. He was the one who, oversaw the Biafra genocide that has claimed many and many lives. And yet, he was one of the people who was on the front line saying African solutions for African problems. And he wanted to be the one to solve it. I'm like, how exactly are you going to solve it when you yourself should be brought to the International Court of Justice for the crimes that
Thank you.
sustained or, enabled to take place. So it's so crazy to me. The people who always block any kind of, outside intervention are the very people who have committed crimes historically. And I think they do it. It's kind of, scratch my back and I'll scratch yours type of situation. Because they know they are all living in a mirror, is it glass house or mirror house? Because yeah, glass house, because they're worried
Glass
about the
house.
precedent they leave. So if they let any kind of, meaningful international intervention into Tigray, they know there will be a precedent that can be used to hold them accountable for the crimes that they have committed historically. The same thing is true in Sudan as well. So it's so crazy to me how this notion of African solutions for African problems would only be used when they know there is a real threat of meaningful international independent accountability that will come back to haunt them. So, I mean, I give it to them. They're very smart. They have effectively protected themselves. They're very effective in whatever they do. If they can only use that kind of brilliance to solve African problems, to truly solve and to better, people's life instead of just building a safe haven for themselves as they continue to eliminate the entire continent. So uh, it's just I'm really passionate about this. It just pisses me off. I get
Mm-hmm.
so angry. I get so mad because as this old man who have been in power for such a long time continue to weaponize their power, it's the young generation that is literally falling like a leaf. It's people like you and I. If you and I were either in Sudan or in Tigray today, chances are that either we would have been raped by now, or we would have been killed in one of the massacres, or we would have been starving to death,
100%.
or would have lost hope in our country, in our homes, uprooted because of conflict, and we would have found ourselves on the hands of illegal human traffickers, where our organs would be harvested and sold on a market in the Middle East. So it boils my heart. Like,
Yep. And this is why I always think I'm just like the only difference between me and what's happening there is my physical location. But then even on that, like each one of us are very vocal. Each one of us really use our platform. That's
yeah.
target on your back. So as terrible as all of the like and aggressive as all that is going on there is happening, us being who we are and using our platforms the way that we do, we would have gotten the worst of it. Like we would have been like, I don't even want to think about it right now, but to be able to be here with you two and have conversation like this would
No,
never
or
fly
even
with Bashir.
now, or even now. I mean, like, even within this war, you
Or
see
even now,
people
right?
like journalists and activists and lawyers who are directly targeted by both sides of the conflict in Sudan because they don't want they don't want that reality to be shown. I mean, each side is saying
No.
that they're fighting for the liberation of Sudan and for the Sudanese people, but really they're fighting for themselves. Um,
Well, you can't be fighting for Sudanese liberation when no one in Sudan wants you.
you like, exactly. I, what I wanted to say, I think, for like a positive note is we've said all of this about how African solutions for African problems is just lip service, right? It's just something they say to get out of accountability, but nothing really comes from it. Uh, I truly believe in the concept of African solutions for African problems. because nobody knows us better than us. And we've seen throughout our history that Western solutions do not apply to African problems. You know, the way even right now, if you consider what's happening with the war in Sudan, right? In terms of humanitarian aid, the way that humanitarian aid is delivered is completely foreign to these Western organizations. They do not know how to function within Sudan, and their structures are so rigid that they cannot be, they can't find that flexibility in order for their work to matter in Sudan. Now, who is doing the humanitarian work in Sudan? It's the people themselves. It's the emergency response rooms and the resistance committees and the volunteers who are intimately knowledgeable of their environment, of their communities, of their government. There is no government, but whatever their government, the powers that be, and how things work, right? They know how to navigate this this minefield, and so they're the ones who have been the most effective, the most efficient at delivering that aid, right? I my dream is to get to a place where it is truly about African solutions for African problems, where we don't have to look to somebody else to solve our issues or to help us, that we, because we're so united and knowledgeable about each other, about our own circumstances and about each other, that there is no need to look outward. That our first instinct is to look inward, is to look across the continent or across our borders to each other. I think that's totally possible, but it right now it's not, because we have a generation of leaders who refuse to give power over to a new one. And also the fact that we're still being, I mean, that generation or those leaders are still being bought, right? Because everything that's been done has been done for personal gain as opposed to national interests, right? And so, yeah, and so not you know, having, centering yourself as a leader has really led to the demise of our countries. Sudan is a prime example of that. The reason why the UAE can have such a hand in this war is because, not because, just because the RSF has had this relationship with them, but because the Sudanese government has had that relationship with them for decades, right? This is not new. Their meddling is not new. The meddling of other countries, the buying off of land, agricultural land in Sudan while people are starving in the country, are resources that are being exported for personal profit, while the country literally crumbles. This is not new, and we've allowed for this to happen. Our governments have allowed for this to happen. So now when people are, I mean, I it's true, and I think we should speak on it. We should speak on the foreign intervention that has led to the, at the very least, the fact that this war is you know is continuing, yeah, prolonged. But I also I feel like a lot of times I just want to scream, like, this is not new. This is not new. This has been happening. People have been talking about it. We've been talking about the exploitation of Sudanese land and resources, the battle, the veritable battle for the Red Sea that has been going on for literal decades. This is not new. And so when people are like, well, how come you're not speaking on it? Because a lot of us are tired. A lot of us are tired of pointing out the obvious. Like, and that's what.
And that's the thing. It's just like the information's there. If you wanted
like,
to know, you would come and find out.
It just further highlights the need for us, first and foremost, to know our history, to look into, to research our own countries, to research our own politics, our own history of exploitation by our own, right? We need to look into that so that we understand that we're just repeating the same patterns. I mean, what's happening right now in Sudan is a repeat. It's literally a rerun of the same kinds of exploitation, the same kinds of violence directed at the same people, right? If we look at the Darfur genocide of 2003, that is continuing to this day.
Yeah.
Which reminds me, I know that like I'm going off on a tangent, but I think one of the things also that we fail to recognize smooth over. I don't know. Right now in the discourse right now about Sudan, a friend of mine said this on Twitter the other day. She said, I want us to be intentional about recognizing that the genocide in Sudan is happening to a specific group of people. It is not happening nationwide. What's happening nationwide is a war. What happened and is happening in Darfur is genocide, right? It is directed at the Masalis and other ethnically African tribes of Darfur. And like, if we don't recognize that, again, we're just repeating the same patterns and the same mistakes. We didn't recognize it in 2003. We didn't recognize it all the way through to 2020. We need to recognize it now. And so, you know.
And honestly, just even to that one thing that I'm still having a hard time, like even wrapping myself around, like the Sudanese blacks and the Sudanese Arabs, just even that whole like narrative there.
And wild. It's wild and it makes no sense. It literally makes no sense.
Yeah.
And I mean, it only benefits.
And that's the thing. I'm just like, y'all are maybe half a shade different, but guess what? To the rest of the world, you black.
Even that, like, let's assume that there really is a drastic difference, right? We're talking about generations of people who grew up in Sudan with Sudanese culture as we know it, right? Whether it be the mainstream Sudanese culture or their own ethnic tribal cultures. At what point do people stop becoming that thing that they came from all those generations ago? At what point do we start becoming Sudanese? Like, where's the cutoff? You know what I mean? And the other thing is, this discourse of like Arab versus African was just used to oppress. We're just using the same narrative. We're defending the same narrative that's been used to oppress us. And what Maaza said earlier about that oppression will find you eventually. For so long, we were so proud and touting the Arab flag, and now it's come back to bite us in the butt, and we don't know what to do with it. Yeah, and we don't know what to do with it. And like, I mean, it's very hard to explain. This is very hard to explain to people who are not familiar with the Sudanese context, and it's hard to explain within the Sudanese context itself. I think that, like, you know, Akeem was saying that earlier. I was so surprised by the level of similarity between what he was describing and what we experience in Sudan. This idea that, like, on these borders, people are coming in and out, right? These tribes that are on one side of the border are on the other side of the border, right? Let's talk about you know, the RSF. Let's talk about the RSF and the fact that right now the narrative for many people is the RSF is a foreign force. That's why we should be against them, because they did all these crimes, but also they're not even from here. And it's like, yeah, okay, there are some people who are not from Sudan that are part of the RSF. Certainly the RSF recruits mercenaries from across the Sahel. Yeah, I'll agree to that. But there is a very big portion of the RSF that is Sudanese. And they're from tribes that are found on the border between Sudan and Chad, or Sudan and Central African Republic. Like, these places, because these borders are arbitrary. These borders were drawn up by folks that knew nothing about us.
See, there's this comment. We have an identity
we
problem.
Don't want to recognize that there are as Africans, and then again it goes back to this, like, African solutions for African problems and knowing ourselves, is that these tribes are mobile, right? They're nomadic. They move from here to there. They're found here, but they're also found on the other side of the border. Does that mean that they're not from the same tribe, right? Ethnically, they are related, maybe in terms of nationality because of this arbitrary, right? But ethnically, they're related. So can we really say that, you know, it's just, I was really blown away, like I said, by the similarity, the fact that people who live on this side of the border are suddenly othered. And we've seen that throughout our history, that we're suddenly othered, right? The same thing with South Sudan. People from previously Southern Sudan were all over the country. And overnight, it became, well, I mean, the oppression is decades long, but overnight, this a border was drawn there, and all of a sudden you're from a different country. But where does that leave the people who grew up, for example, in Khartoum? South Sudanese people who grew up in Khartoum, that's all they know. And all of a sudden you're telling them you're not from here
Yeah.
anymore, you're from over there. And you go over there and you don't fit in over there, right? Because you're culturally,
No,
you're
you had
from here.
nothing to do with
So
it.
I just, I think it goes back to this idea of like, we need reconciliation within our own countries, within our own diverse communities. There's no reconciliation, and there's no development that happens without reconciliation. There's no development that happens without recognizing our position in society versus other ethnic groups, how experience of life in Sudan may have differed for people depending on where they're from in Sudan, depending on what their ethnic makeup is. Building those bonds again, we won't get out of this hole if we don't do that. To me, we won't.
Yeah, and to the point of reconciliation, like hand in hand with that comes the truth, and it goes back to that whole key about like really educating ourselves as to who we were before they told us who we are, right? And even so, I've always had this like complexity with like, just I'll use Sudan for example, like Sudan, right? So we recognize this whole line was artificially created, nothing that really had to do with the people, and came from foreign outside influence. And yet, we're more often dedicated to that than we are to what the rest of the continent has for us, right? Folks will be so attached to I am Sudanese before I am African, but you were African before you were Sudanese, according to these borders, right? And so to me, that speaks to that like education piece. Like, can we really start going back into some more ancestral, traditional ways of being in community, in relation with one another? And one of the things that Sada was mentioning that I absolutely loved, and I'll just kind of summarize it, when we're saying like African solutions for African problems, to me that is like grassroots collectivism is what we're talking about in that sense, right? And right now it's what you were saying, the weaponization of Pan-Africanism to actually oppress Africans. And so at the end of the day, the truth through the education, the reconciliation, through the deep reintegration of some of those older systems that actually allowed us to like unify with one another, and finding ways and means of empowerment and uplift, because we can't have that tribe country hyper individuality anymore. It is destroying us.
I would push back on that. Yeah.
No, go, please. Tell me. I
For
love
me,
it.
and I know the very, unique elements of like our struggle. I'm very much cognizant of that. But that logic, I don't think it applies in Ethiopia, for example, because Ethiopia has never been colonized, for example.
Break
So
it down for
most of
me.
our problems don't necessarily come. Of course, there is this mental slavery, which is a lot worse than the actual slavery. Or, I mean, it's really bad. Mental slavery is really bad. You don't have anyone imposing these ideas. You just worship it so much that you idolize it, and it's like you give your free will to be colonized. So there is a mental colonization that is so common in Ethiopia. But our borders and stuff, other than the border between Ethiopia and Eritrea, it really has never been that much of an issue. I know there were some, conflict, like not conflict, but there were issues historically, but not in the recent history. Most of our problem comes from this unwillingness to recognize differences, unwillingness to accept that there is beauty in diversity. You don't necessarily need to have a unitary state that doesn't recognize these innate differences people have. Tribe is not a bad thing. How you manage, how you handle that is the bad thing. Having different ethnic groups, nations is not necessarily a bad thing. How you manage it is the problem. So when you try to create a system that doesn't recognize these differences and idealizes only one of these nations, and you try to force every other nation or tribe to emulate that, while completely ignoring who they are, completely ignoring the innate differences that they have, their beautiful culture, their language, way of life, and everything, that's when tribe becomes a problem. But tribe by itself, I don't think is a problem. Like, I am a Tigray, for example. Yeah,
Oh no,
yeah.
I love my
Mm-hmm.
tribe. But here's my question though. 300 years ago, were these still similar
So
issues within the tribe?
I believe there were issues that the way this, like,
Mhm.
maybe the issues that they were arguing about, the issues that they were fighting over could be different, but I believe we're human beings, so their conflict is inevitable. It would always
Yeah,
happen.
yeah,
The way you manage conflict is what matters. So we shouldn't really strive to eliminate conflicts. I think we should strive to find a mechanism that would help us resolve these conflicts amicably. I think that's what we should aim towards. And in the Tigray context, for example, I am Ethiopian. I was Ethiopian because I am Tigrayan. I am Tigran, and an Ethiopia that denies me the right to recognize myself and live as a Tigran is nothing to me. There isn't, like, in the Ethiopian context,
yeah.
there isn't an identity called Ethiopian, because Ethiopia is the coming together of different nations and nationalities. Different tribes come together to make Ethiopia what it is today. So if, as a government or as an Ethiopian community, someone is trying to stop me from speaking my language, someone is trying to stop me from, talking in Tigrinya, like appreciating and living my Tigrayan heritage and identity, like, fuck that country. I don't want that. So I mean, pardon my French, but like, so I think for me,
No,
it's really important to accept that there are innate differences. These are not man-made differences. These are not manufactured differences. These are differences that we were born into. I was born as a Tigran. And so I love and appreciate my identity. That doesn't mean I don't like other tribes. That doesn't mean I want them to forego their culture and emulate mine. It just means I want to have the space and the right to be who I am authentically, so others can also be and coexist. So I feel like, for me, the solution should be in accepting who we are as individuals and find collectivism within, or build a community around that. Because like, Ethiopia has always been a very diverse country, but we have always been a communal society at the same time. It doesn't have to be either or. You can be who you are as a small unit, and you can have a common ground. Like I said, Ethiopians came together and they built this country called Ethiopia. The Oromos came, the Amharas, the Tigrans, the Somali, and everyone else came together to make Ethiopia what it is today. If you take one of these nations from Ethiopia, then Ethiopia will cease as a country because it's one member short. So, like this, we have to understand how nations are created. We have to understand what role, tribes and ethnicity plays in building that nation. If we fail to do that, and if you focus on creating this, pan-Ethiopian, or, like, a united identity for our countries, we risk marginalizing ethnic groups. We risk marginalizing tribes. And these are the tribes, the ethnic groups are what makes our country what it is. So I think it's really important to recognize the differences and accept the fact that we need to find, like, a common ground within our differences. So that, and then the other,
Okay,
yeah,
so here's what I'm
just
gonna
one more
say.
point.
Oh, wait,
The
no,
other
no,
point
no, I don't want
Sarah
to
was
finish.
talking about is,
Okay, okay, okay.
ideally, I also love the idea of African solutions for African problems, but I think it's just an idea. I don't think it's practical. I don't think it's pragmatic in the current, context of things. And that's why, like, I push back against this idea of African solutions, African problems, given the fact that Africa has been ridden by many genocides, and these leaders have never ever built institutions that can effectively find solutions for these problems. The reason why, in Sudan, for example, the reason why Sudan continues to, I studied political science and IR, so I have studied the Sudan conflict as well. Why Sudan continue to find itself in this never-ending circle of bloodshed is because there has never been true accountability. There has never been real justice. There has been reconciliation, or something that looks like reconciliation, But you can't never have a true reconciliation if there is no accountability. You know, this like, oh, you know, we're like a community, we have to find ways to coexist and move on, focus on reconciliation. No, the ultimate way you can find a stable solution for problems is having justice and accountability at the front. And accountability means many different things. It could mean, you know, compensation, it could mean recognition, acknowledgement of guilt, but it most definitely should include prosecution. Unless and otherwise you have a prosecution, then you're not sending a message. The